Welcome, everybody, to this episode of The Interview by the Nordic Model. I'm your host, Chad, and today I'll be interviewing Stephen Nuñez about guaranteed basic income. So just to briefly start off, what's the, hello, Steve, and what, in your view, if you want to introduce yourself, go ahead. And what's the sort of general elevator pitch for a guaranteed income?
Thanks for having me on. So I'm a lead researcher on guaranteed income at the Jain Family Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization located in New York City. And I came on about 2 years ago to sort of lead policy work on guaranteed income. I think the elevator pitch on guaranteed income is maybe three parts, right? One, that it's universal, two, that it's unconditional, and three, that it's cash. And I think each one of these is important and sort of addresses maybe some of the deficiencies in the current safety net that we have. In the kind of Anglo-American welfare state, you have very heavily targeted, means tested benefits. It goes to a very specific subset of people: the disabled, the elderly, parents with young children, and leaves pretty much everybody else out of it. It's also often conditional. There are work requirements for many of these programs, and depending on the state or the program, you may also be expected to do drug tests in order to remain in compliance with the benefit. And then finally, when there is assistance offered, it's often given in the form of vouchers, where it very specifically says, here's some aid, but you can only use it on the things that we've determined you need, and not these other things. These are fancy beans, you can't buy these, or so forth. So, what does guaranteed income do? Well, it's cash, right? So it means households are given aid that they can use in the way that they see fit for their individual needs. Using, I guess, their own context-specific information about what it is that would be best for them. It's unconditional, meaning that people are not expected to meet these requirements that are many times not under their control, like labor market outcomes. We've seen that having a work conditions safety net can be quite disastrous when there's a recession and people simply cannot find work. But certainly it's the case that at any given time, there's a subset of households that are dealing with illness, layoffs, other sorts of things that are not necessarily under their control. And that, to add insult to injury, they're having their aid pulled or reduced as a result of it. And then this sort of targeting and means testing, as I said, there are groups of people who don't have any access to the safety net, and that's obviously terrible for poverty and for the material hardship of large swaths of the population. But I think a lot of the work that we've done over the last few years is to also highlight how having a system of heavy means testing, heavy targeting actually puts a huge burden on individuals who are eligible under those rules, because they have to fill out paperwork and remain in compliance in order to receive their benefits. So what ends up happening is that a lot of people are unaware of benefits, or they don't understand how to apply for them. They make mistakes and they are incorrectly rejected. For people who are already on the benefits, people who have to do recertifications, and if there's conditionality, drug tests or so forth, there are paperwork delays or mistake that lead to people falling off of benefits for periods of time until they can recertify. That kind of churn is another sort of feature of our safety net. So I think, a guaranteed income in being universal, in doing away with this sort of means testing, upfront means testing and conditionality, in getting rid of the, this sort of limitations on how the aid can be spent is just sort of a huge improvement over the way that we currently provide income support in our safety net. But, I think unlike at least some people who think, UBI is the way forward to essentially replace the safety net. We just give people money and send them into the marketplace to meet their needs. I think we recognize that, markets are incomplete, that there are major market failures. And depending on what we're talking about in terms of, problems, whether it be around, healthcare or education or housing, simply giving people money and sending them into the market is not going to be sufficient. And the government really does need to consider sort of other ways to intervene especially on the supply side. So I think a lot of our work over the last few years has been to kind of lay out, how a guaranteed income could improve on what we currently have, but also where a guaranteed income is not going to cut it, where there needs to be, further work done and further assistance provided, not just cash to engage in the markets.
Okay, yeah. So that was very well put. And one of the things, so you mentioned that there's this sort of like right-wing contingency. There are right-wing kind of UBI supporters that support it as replacing the welfare state entirely. And this comes from, I mean, in some sense, it comes from like very high trust in the free market. I think on the on the left, there's often a sort of hesitancy towards UBI, kind of for the same reason, where there's this like view that what we should be doing is like universal basic services or decommodification, although I think that's kind of a confused term at times, where the idea is essentially just like providing in-kind benefits to people, and of course I'm not so sure that like these two things are opposed to one another. This is something that you just alluded to, that like in some cases cash is good and in some cases in-kind benefits are good. And so I was hoping to kind of get your thoughts on, what types of things, is cash good for, and what types of things, ought to be provided, as free at point of service, services by the government.
Well, I think that it's well known that credit and insurance markets are just incomplete. And that, UBI, it's not like I can, if you handed me cash, I could just go to this, go out to the insurance shop and buy myself, unemployment insurance that would be sort of sufficient for my needs. Now you could say maybe, if we got rid of the public unemployment insurance system, the market would then sort of pop up. But, to the extent that happens, I imagine the market would pop up with the sorts of problems that you might expect in a market with majorly asymmetric information, which is there would be a whole group of people who they would essentially just sort of not allow to receive the insurance because they're too high of a risk, or maybe more organically they would come in and the insurance premiums would start to rise because of sort of adverse selection issues, and eventually you'd end up with a situation where it's so expensive that only very middle class people would be able to receive it, and then you're left with a huge problem, which is that a whole bunch of people don't receive a UI system, right? So I think when you get to things like health insurance or unemployment insurance, that's one area, like social insurance provision, where I just don't think that income support is going to cut it, right? And you could say like, well, yeah, you could have a really, really big UBI, but then you have to think about the costs associated with doing something like that, to essentially give everybody $30,000 or $40,000 a year every year on the off chance that they are one of the sort of the tail risk folks who end up, unemployed and deeply in need of that aid. That seems like a kind of a crazy way to build a system, where instead what you really want is a true insurance system with payroll taxes as to support it. I mean, to give you a sort of a sense of what that might look like Aaron Dubé has talked about, a system that's done at the federal level, a UI system that provides, an 80% replacement wage, extremely high up the income distribution, as well as a job seekers allowance for people who are just entering the job market or returning to the job market, or folks who've had their sort of larger UI expire. And a program like that would cost something like $110 billion a year, versus a UBI that we talk about multiple trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars a year, just to make sure that a particular group of people aren't sort of left worse off. I think, though, beyond sort of social insurance, you could then just say like, oh, all right, well, we should have universal catastrophic health insurance, and then everything else should be out of pocket, and UBI health savings accounts. But I think the problems with the health insurance and healthcare market run much deeper than sort of the insurance issues. There's just a lot of evidence to show, that even if you give people health savings accounts and even if you throw money into those health savings accounts and you give them catastrophic insurance, with very high deductibles, they don't shop around. They indiscriminately cut back on care because they actually don't have any real good sense of what is, necessary sort of prophylactic care and what's sort of, like, oh, it's probably just like nothing. It's just an ache, it'll go away or whatever. And that is terrible because in the long run, it leads to poorer health outcomes for everybody, and more expense for the folks running the insurance programs going forward. So, I think there's another area where a public option at the very least could be important. I think, again, where I don't know exactly where I fall on this spectrum, but I think YIMBY idea of let's get rid of, all these zoning laws that prevent private developers and government alike from building anything is absolutely correct, right? The regulation isn't automatically awesome. And so we get rid of the zoning laws and we take away control from the sort of the local NIMBY folks and we allow building. But is that enough? Or is there actually going to need to be, substantial investment by the federal government, by state governments, in sort of in affordable housing construction and public housing benefits. And I'm not sure exactly where I come down on this, but I'm very open to the idea that that's necessary. And we at JFI we brought on Paul Williams, who you might know, who's a housing expert, and I talk with him about this, and I think he makes a very compelling case that something like that would actually, be extremely beneficial on the supply side. And then I think one thing that I'm really exploring right now is in the context of the child tax credit, there's absolutely a battle going on right now about the relative sort of merit and strengths and weaknesses of sort of a child allowance versus, child care provision, right? You have in child care provision, you have Ball-Mal's cost disease. So you have just, the cost is going up, but at the same time, the people who are actually providing the care are not actually sort of reaping the benefits of that. A child allowance is obviously not going to be enough to cut it when childcare in some of the major cities can run you, $20,000 to $30,000 per child per year. So you could say some of that is like, oh, well, wealthier people can eat that. And I guess they can on some level, but that cost is, even if you're doing, non-center care, if you're doing care in somebody's apartment or whatever, you're still paying $15,000, $20,000 a year. And, for folks who have stay-at-home parents, there's a stay-at-home parent, or they have, they have family or neighbors or whoever that they can rely on to take care of their children. Obviously the childcare isn't necessarily all that important to them, but not everybody has that. So you could definitely, again, imagine that the government might want to be involved in providing childcare, and you could do it through this sort of subsidy system, which is what they seem to be doing, or you could do what other countries have, and they just have publicly provided childcare. Mm-hmm. Because the subsidy system is going to have exactly the issues that you might think it has, right? People who have previously not been able to get childcare or to get the kind of high quality childcare that they want are going to sort of flood into that, and prices are going to spike, so the subsidy is going to have to go up, and mm-hmm. what happens to the people who are just above the subsidy line, so there's a lot of that kind of stuff. So I'm not strident in any of this. I'm really increasingly sort of thinking hard about, in childcare, in housing, in education, and in healthcare, all areas where the market just is not functioning well. What we can do to provide, public, direct public service. I mean, and this is all post, this is not pre-distribution, as we say, right? Like we're not even talking yet about what needs to be done to make the labor market itself, mm-hmm. More equitable. Stuff like, sectoral bargaining and other kinds of regulations. That's kind of outside of my wheelhouse at the moment, sure. but it's something that I'm certainly interested in kind of exploring more over time.
One thing I have to mention for all the Nordic Model fans out there is that you mentioned Paul Williams. I recorded an interview with him last week, so by the time this one comes out, there will be an interview with him about public housing. So of course, anyone who's listening to this and hasn't heard the Paul Williams interview, of course, you should be watching that. What are you doing?
So I'll say, I mean, Paul and I, along with a recent hire, Jack Landry, who's we're leading our micro simulation work. We're mm-hmm. currently looking into sort of housing and HCV right now, which is, first, there's this idea that seemed to have been dropped, unfortunately, from the Biden platform to make HCV into an entitlement. So, we're really interested in thinking like, well, what would that actually cost? Because we have really poor data on this. What would that cost before you even get into any kind of behavioral changes that would be invoked by that? But and then two, I guess would be, why cash might be superior. And certainly we're looking into things like, the common story that it's very difficult to find landlords who actually want to accept vouchers. Mm-hmm. On the left, you hear stories about discrimination, both against people of color, and also against, the poor. On the right, you hear, well, actually, it's amazingly burdensome and risky and difficult for landlords to get into this sort of tripartite agreement, for a voucher. And there's probably truth to both of those things, but regardless of the actual relative weights, there just aren't a lot of people who are willing to accept vouchers. So that's an issue. But even then, we still are left with the same problems that we have, which is there's just not a lot of housing in the places where the jobs are, and then we need to do something about that. And simply throwing cash into people's pockets and saying, I'm sure the market will sort it out eventually, is probably not not good enough.
Sure. Okay, so so you mentioned in the initial kind of DMs that we had setting up this interview that the UBI that UBI isn't part of the Nordic model, which is true. But
universalism is. So.
Yes, universalism is. Yes, that's true. Obviously Finland's experimented with it, and but so sort of the as I understand it anyway, and Matt Bruneck writes a lot about this, that kind of the Nordic model when it comes to the welfare state is in essence, okay, we've got all these people who, don't have a market income, right? Because they're old or because they're children or because they're unemployed or because they're disabled, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this sort of categorical approach to the welfare state where in essence, you kind of have, at least in these countries, right? Like we don't have a minimum benefit for unemployment insurance in the United States, for example. But in these countries, each of these individual programs have a minimum benefit, and then they don't quite have a minimum wage, but for the people who do work. But then there's effective wage floors set by sectoral bargaining and these kinds of things. So in some sense, you could view this as a way of providing a basic income in the sense that you're addressing it by category of people. How do you see that? Like, how do you see this? What do you think is missing there? From the way that the Nordic countries have traditionally done their welfare states. What is UBI? Like, how does UBI fit there? What does UBI address that doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, it's the flexibility in part. But so, I mean, I think UBI could be a way to deal with some of these things. So I remember, for example, there's a current discussion right now about the paid leave, right? It's a part of the Build Back Better plan. And of course, one issue is the way that they're actually doing it. They're like, let's give people subsidies to provide it, and these guys, and hopefully they'll do this, right? And the sort of the simpler way, which you'd think that they would do, but they can't because of we won't raise taxes on anybody below 400,000 thing, is simply to implement a payroll tax that covers this, and that's what they do in New York State itself for the paid leave thing. But the other issue is, there is no minimum benefit for folks who aren't working or who didn't work enough to meet this benefit, and there was a huge sort of tussle back and forth about that on Twitter and others. Well, why not just give people who aren't working the minimum benefit? It's not going to cost all that much because, who are we talking about here? But I mean, another thing you could do is build that into the child allowance, right? Like you could say, your child allowance is X number of dollars per month going forward. And by the way, it starts 3 months before your child is born, or for the first 3 months after your child is born, or the first 4 months after your child is born, you receive this additional sort of supplemental income that sort of plays the same role. So I kind of feel like once you have this sort of cash system in place, that's actually reaching people, that there are ways to provide, cash supplements, for, particular categories of people, that can sort of in a fairly straightforward way sort of replicate some of what goes on, there in terms of in terms of providing these in-kind services. Now, I think obviously the political economy of all this is very different, right? So like should the Scandinavian welfare states switch to UBI? Well, I mean, politically speaking, every conceivable sort of group the disabled, the elderly, the poor, students, et cetera, are already covered by a variety of different services and benefits, some in kind, some sort of cash. Like I couldn't imagine what the constituency would be to rock the boat there, right? Mm-hmm. Which is, I guess you could make the argument that, having multiple different systems and each of them having their own phase outs and so forth sort of creates, poverty traps. And therefore, we could create a much more, streamlined and less sort of punishing system by doing, cash assistance. But, I don't know if I were starting from a Nordic welfare state, if I would be particularly excited about that argument. Mm-hmm. From a US system where there's very little solidarity, mm-hmm. And, what we have is a variety of targeted tax benefits or tax credits and so forth. I think there's a different sort of argument that given the way that our system evolved, it makes sense to work with what we have and to expand it. And to, mm-hmm. So we take the tax credit and we make it more generous, much more generous. And we extend the phase out and we remove the phase in, and then voila, we actually have something like a system that provides actual support to children, mm-hmm. or things like with we have Medicare, and maybe we should just change the actual eligibility requirements, and we should have Medicare for kids, right? And then with the total understanding that eventually, there'll be a whole group of people, a cohort of kids who are like 16, 17 or whatever, who are about to lose health insurance. And perhaps that will create the political pressure necessary to extend it further up until eventually you kind of back end yourself into, you back up into sort of in a very roundabout way, like a Medicare mm-hmm. for all system. So I think that a lot of it is we have EITC, we have the child tax credit, or alternatively, we have people pushing on, like a carbon tax. These are potential opportunities to get cash assistance into the hands of people mm-hmm. who would not otherwise receive it. If we can find ways to sort of expand it and, fight back against the reciprocity sort of, and deservingness narratives that tend to sort of, flood the field whenever you suggest these things. But, mm-hmm. I think my ideal system would involve a lot of cash, because I like I'm maybe this is just me being an American, but I kind of hate one type of American. I just hate the paternalism associated with we're going to cover this, and this, but not this other thing because mm-hmm. that's not approved, right? And as middle-class people, we've determined that you poor people have the following 3 needs or the following 4 needs, right. and here's how we're going to provide them for you. I tend to not like that. I like systems that kind of trust people to when it makes sense to do so, to sort of meet their own needs, and to decide what those needs are and how to fulfill them. Mm-hmm. With the complete understanding that there are absolutely times where it's absolutely wrong and cruel to just, give people $1 and kick them into the market and expect them to figure it out when the market itself just doesn't work.
Right.
I do think,
okay.
Yeah, I would say the one other thing I would say is that there's a political economy. Yeah, as I said, the people who have what they have don't necessarily want to gamble it on a universal system. But I think there is an argument to be made, and you hear this, which is if you take all these different quasi-cash programs, vouchers, and so forth, and you replace them all with cash, you've now created a single administration and a single income stream. And that means that sort of income stream and that administration is now going to be the target of the right for like chopping it down. So that it's almost like the 17 or 18 different programs, each with their own like inefficiencies, with their poverty, the poverty traps and the multiple benefits cliffs that interact in strange ways and so forth, is almost like a laundered welfare state, right? Like this is the best way that we can protect it from the right is by creating this like Rube Goldberg device. There may be something to that, but I mean, the damage that it does to the people who receive it, I think is quite a steep cost. And it's something that I would really like to see us find ways to make this all, much less burdensome and awful to the people who currently rely on it.
Sure. I think that is like an interesting way to think about it. The sort of like, a laundered welfare state. I mean, I suppose that this is somewhat more applicable. I mean, I would think, it somewhat more directly describes like the existing American welfare state, where there's a million different, vouchers, these sorts of things. And I will say, by the way, I mean, there are definitely pushes, right? Like in Finland was one example, right? In the Nordic countries for UBI. And a lot of people,
Because I was just going to say, because their entire argument was that it was going to increase employment. And so their argument was, instead of having all these phase outs, the substitution elasticities of labor supply, being, battered by these high implicit marginal tax rates, we can get rid of that or at least some of it and replace it with something that essentially only has an income effect and doesn't have a substitution effect. So it's kind of like interesting to think of it like essentially right wingers pushing for it, or maybe centrists pushing for it as this will enhance the labor supply, which I find kind of fascinating because it's really just not the discussion that we're having in the U.S. Sorry.
Right. Yeah. I did want to bring up that's actually where I was going to go next, was to talk a little bit about the Finland experiment. A lot of it's like, I think there's a lot of talk about the Finland experiment. Usually, to say in some sense that like UBI doesn't really work or these sorts of things, when in reality this wasn't a comparison of UBI versus not, right? It was a comparison of UBI versus basically their minimum benefit for unemployment insurance, right? And so they basically divided they took a bunch of people who were on their minimum benefit, sort of like long-term unemployed people, and switched some of them over to a UBI. And so it is sort of an interesting flip, where the idea was, okay, if we say that we're going to keep giving you income even if you get a job, the idea was to increase employment. The left in Finland also, support UBI for different reasons, right? But not to replace the minimum benefit of unemployment insurance. The idea was like, so people could, take their own personal projects, right? So you don't need like a job seeker benefit, or you don't need to be looking for a job. It's just, I can leave work and pursue some personal project and take income. That's where the left support came from. And I think one maybe interesting thing to take away from the Finland experiment, or an interesting worry maybe for people kind of on the left who are pushing for a UBI, is because there's this sort of like broad support, but support for different reasons, like across the political spectrum, that you can take all of this, all of this like effort and enthusiasm, and then it goes through the machinations of the process. And it ends up being, what sort of happened in Finland, where it turns into kind of the right-wing version of UBI, as the process happens. So I sort of wanted to get your thoughts on how we stop that from happening, right? How we kind of like keep this kind of clear-eyed vision.
I mean, that's a good question, and it's something I wrestle with. And it's people are concerned about this, which is, imagine you're like UBI or bust, right? And then you find that you're yourself in coalition with, Charles Murray types.
Right.
And then you could very quickly start to lie to yourself and be like, okay, well, it's not going to be big enough. And maybe the price that we pay to get it into place is that we have to get rid of these other sort of deeper benefits. But, we can iterate on that. And then it doesn't the set part two never comes, right? So there's a constant discussion like that in American politics, right? Like go back to NAFTA, right? We're gonna do free trade, and it's gonna grow the pot, but we realize that like a whole bunch of people in the middle are gonna get hurt by this, but then we're going to provide them with the aid to sort of repair to equity. We're going to give them, job training, and we're going to, help them relocate if necessary. And then that didn't happen, right? And then, European welfare states have very typically VATs, like value-added tax, and it's a great way to raise funding. But, if you're not looking at if you're looking at it in gross terms, not net terms, it's obviously regressive and it hurts poor people. And then when people talk about, implementing a VAT in the United States in order to support a much larger welfare state, you have people on the left, like not the fake left. I mean, like the left saying, yeah, you're going to release the VAT, and then phase two never comes, right? Like they're going to introduce it, and then so there's no trust there that it's ever going to build there. And I think the same thing is happening with sort of UBI on the left. There are people who just are very worried that there are going to be horrible compromises made to get something like this into place. And I think it's tough because you do want to build a coalition, right? You want to show folks in the center and the right, like this is a benefit that, you can support too, and so forth. But you don't want to give away the farm and trying to build that alliance, that coalition. So, I'm having discussions now with people about like, look how many different pilots have emerged over the last, the last year and a half or so. Before the pandemic, very few. Now, tons of them, dozens everywhere. Like, what's going to come out of that? Well, most of these are at the city level. They're using either private funds or sort of, federal pandemic relief funds. There's no real, sense of what, what a revenue stream, in order to fund something like this would look like. So now there's discussions about like wave two, and wave two is, maybe we should be providing guaranteed income to, returning citizens. And this will be really, this will be really a good idea because we can show from like a cost benefit analysis for the person, from the taxpayer perspective, that this is going to be cost effective. And that's almost certainly true. And I think it's absolutely the case that, people should be thinking about how to provide all sorts of support, including cash, to returning citizens. I know there's some people who are thinking about, with marijuana being legalized and taxed now, that some of those that revenue should be going to, to reparative justice, including, aid for returning citizens, people who've had their records expunged. And, guaranteed income might be one of the ways that happens. But you could easily imagine the part where the universal unconditional cash turns into the heavily targeted unconditional cash, cash only for the very poor, or cash only for returning citizens, or only for the homeless, using a sort of a very sort of narrow, cynical, taxpayer cost benefit analysis sort of frame. You see that, right? You see that in these discussions that people have around, is UBI the same thing as guaranteed income? Well, guaranteed income is heavily targeted. And you're like, let's in our desire to get this thing passed, or to make these improvements, let's make sure that we don't sort of surrender the frame to the people who are opposed to this. So how to exactly deal with this? I mean, it's something that I struggle with. My colleague Hala Ahmad and I are going to be writing the fourth white paper in our series about the political economy of guaranteed income. And what we're talking about, right, you and I are talking about right now is exactly that, right? Like, how do we build on this? What does the future look like? What are the pitfalls where we kind of back ourselves into if I could somehow get rid of the phase in for EITC, I would absolutely do it. Right. But an EITC, given how quickly it phases out and how small it is not really I'm not going to call it a day. Right. But I think to make the argument for like cash assistance, there are certainly folks who would say like, well, this is what we can get past. And this is what it takes to get the right wingers on board. So we're going to do it. So I think we're in for some interesting times in the what's next, even before we get into the larger discussion about the political dysfunction in the United States, the multiple veto points, and everything else that's going on.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I've seen some people talk about, if you start with like food stamps or something, right, and you take, remove the asset tests and all that stuff, so it's just an income test, and then you make it cash based, and now you have a negative income tax, basically, right?
Sort of, yeah.
And so that the one that's state administered. So, but I mean, so there seem to be like a number of kind of points here, things that you could expand that would kind of get you closer to this. Yeah. I wonder with you mentioned like, kind of cutting off the phase ends for tax credits and stuff, although that's there still seem to be some issues there, right? Because it's still, you're still administering it through the IRS instead of like an actual presumably a guaranteed income. You don't send checks out to people rather than kind of hoping non-filers find the random, the scam looking website the government puts out.
Yeah. So there's a lot of problems there because I mean, so first of all, Jack Landry, right, the fellow who we brought on for microsimulations, and I have been like writing papers about this right now, which is that we have, I wouldn't say terrible coverage, right? Like it's something probably in the 85 to 88% coverage for a program that just started. So that's not terrible. But the people who are being left out are still almost certainly the poorest of those of the eligible,
so
right?
Kind of a phase in.
So yeah. So I mean, what is it? Well, some people literally don't know about it. They don't understand, and that can be dealt with, right? Because I mean, this is the first time basically ever that in their minds that the government is just going to give you cash without a work requirement. So like, why would you ever have even filed taxes before that? So there's that. But then it's difficult to file taxes, even with the non-filer form. People don't necessarily have computers or understand what they're doing, and will need to be sort of helped through the process. And you can see that the filer, the initial sort of scam webpage was terrible. They made it much better, but they're still not pulling in that many people through it, because when you leave it to people to do the work to enroll, you get sort of limited enrollment. And I think there's a lot of research around outreach, like informing people and like literally contacting them. Did you know that this is a thing, right? And it helps very modestly. You really do have to help people through the process. And even better than that would be in auto enrollment, right? So right now, there are nonprofits that are like basically walking through, hospitals and dropping off baby bags, for people. In those baby bags, like saying like there is a child tax credit, and like you are automatically able to do this, and you need to fill out this form, and we can help you, right? So like I've had kids. When you have a kid, a person comes into the room and walks you through signing up for Social Security cards for your kid, and walks you through the birth certificate, and lets you know what sort of services in the community might be provided. Like, the government needs to be doing that, right? The government should be proactively enrolling people at the point of birth. The government has an enormous number. There are the states and local governments administer a lot of different programs. The IRS should be coordinating with those programs so that if people are enrolling in those programs or renewing those programs, or go in to talk to their case manager or whatever, they should be enrolled right then and there in the child tax credit too. So I think, I don't know if we're stuck with an IRS based system, but if we are stuck with an IRS based system, we have to do everything in our power to make it more like a child allowance and less like a child tax credit. And that's going to mean, again, like the government taking on the burden of administering this program. I mean, it's one reason why I'm not, I don't trust the states. So state administered benefits like SNAP, I am not super excited about. I want to federalize UI. I would love to see all of this stuff moved to the, to the Social Security Administration if possible. But, the Social Security Administration is a benefits administering admin. The IRS has essentially, for its entire history, been a revenue collecting thing, right? So if we're going to put it on them, we actually need to build a sort of a benefits administering sort of capacity that the IRS really just doesn't have yet. And I think it's not even that too, right? Which is that there has to be somewhere to send the checks, and it's 6, depending on what you're talking about, like depending on the estimate, 6 to 8% of the population is unbanked. And of course, those are the poorer folks. What do we have? Well, we have some kind of private-public partnerships like Bank On or whatever to try to like get people enrolled. And we have credit unions that are kind of exist in some places. And, why don't we have a public banking option, right? Here's a situation where there absolutely needs to be government provision to create a receptacle for the benefits that we're trying to the benefits pipeline that we're trying to build. Postal banking, Fed accounts, some combination of Fed accounts, accessed through brick and mortar post offices. There has to be something like that. Otherwise, the tax system has a lot of seepage. Even if people get the benefits, what ends up happening with the ITC and what's absolutely going to happen with the CTC is you have for-profit third-party providers, H&R Block types or whatever, who are going to help, in quotation marks, you get your benefit and are going to take a cut of it. Or, you're going to have to, cash your check at the local check casher, and they're going to take a cut of it. So, I mean, the net transfer is not going to be what it needs to be. There's evidence that among those who, receive the EITC, about 50% of them use paid tax prep. And then on average, depending on the year, they lose something like 15 to 20% of their EITC benefit to, fees and services in quotation marks from that paid tax prep. So, I mean, we have an abysmal system here and if this is what we have to work with, if the IRS is going to and the tax credit is going to be, or the EITC is going to be the basis for, a cash safety net, then we're going to have to do an enormous amount of work, to improve that. And I know, Elaine Mag of the Urban Institute, Samuel Hammond of Niskanen, have just, I think yesterday, actually released a report on this. I haven't got a chance to read it yet, but it was sort of, but I'm sure it's knowing Elaine and Sam, I think it's going to be almost certainly going to be quite interesting. Now that we have this system, how do we make the most of it? And what are the potential pathways, if possible, to jumping to something better, like a Social Security Administration.
Okay. So we're running a little bit short on, or we're running kind of close to time. So I just want to just like one final question, and just sort of, if you could, kind of beam one thought into the general public about UBI. Like if you get the general public to understand one thing that you understand about UBI, what would that be? Like, what message would you communicate?
Oh, that's a good one, I think. So there's this sort of idea that means testing is absolutely necessary, right? We can't give checks to Jeff Bezos, i.e. James Medlock. But we should give James is awesome. So we can't do that, right? Like we have to have means testing, right? But means testing is an administrative choice, right? A negative income tax and a UBI on paper can be distributionally identical, right? Because you raise taxes on rich people, and then the net transfer that they receive is not the check that they got, the $1,000 per month check that they got in the mail. It's it's negative something per month based off of the taxes. The difference, of course, is that on paper, they're distributionally, identical. So, you should be neutral between the two, right? But actually no, because when you put the negative income tax style, puts the administrative burden on the recipients again, which means people not getting the benefit that they are supposed to get, or the full amount of it because of third party crap. So. UBI is a way to ensure that people who need the benefit get the benefit. And it's not a giveaway to rich people unless you decide to structure it that way. And there's no reason to structure it that way. Just because there's stuff happening on the back end that you don't see doesn't mean that it's not being paid for, through making sure that the rich pay their fair share. So I think I really do. And I think this is a misconception that is not just folks who are, anti-cash assistance or anti-UBI or whatever. It's something that I hear even from people who are really excited about the idea of guaranteed income. We don't want rich people to get it, so we're going to means test it so that they don't. And I said, I think you're just really misunderstanding, what the universality of a guaranteed income is all about. It's a universality on the benefits side, and there are amazingly important administrative reasons to do that. But that doesn't mean that we're not that the rich people are getting net $12,000 a year out of this, or whatever it is that you've decided. They're paying taxes. They're just paying taxes on the back end. Like means testing is a tax. I mean, it's a tax that people don't understand, but it's a tax.
It's a tax at the point of benefit dispersal.
Yes.
So in any case, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was very informative for me, and I'm sure the viewers as well. I guess have a good day.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I'm really happy to that you had me on, and give a link to the Jain Family Institute stuff. We have a lot of good stuff coming out. I think I'll toot my own horn here. And obviously, like we have a lot of good stuff from Claudia Sam and other people emerging over the last few months, and more to come. So really excited about everything that we've been planning.
Well, yeah, we'll link that in the description. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to have me on.